Good afternoon, everyone. I was saying that I've been to this building many times now and to this room, but this is the first time that I see it configured in this space, which just goes to show that this is still a very new building, and it's so fantastic to have the Gordon Center. Anyway, I'm not here to talk about the Gordon Center for Creative and Performing Arts. I'm here to talk about, to introduce the Lunder Institute at Colby College Museum of Art. My name is Jackie Terraza, and I am the Carolyn Mussey Director of the Colby College Museum of Art. And it is my great pleasure to be here along with our partners, with Erica, and with all of you to really culminate what has been the first season of this series. What I'd like to do is just take a little moment to ask you a very short and seemingly simple question. So I'm going to ask you to turn to your neighbor and try to answer the question in a simple way as possible. What is American art?
I surveyed 40 institutions to do this for me, so I don't have to.
I'm going to stop you now because, as you can probably tell, it's seemingly simple. It's not very simple, and if I was going to ask each of you what the response to your question is, we would probably get a lot of different answers. And similarly, the question that this series asked, what is the state of American art, was equally complex in spite of its simplicity. And so that is what's exciting about what has been happening since February, as each partner institution represented here on our panel has crafted public programs and has had internal conversations that offer different kinds of responses to this question. And in each case, each event and its content has reflected both the institution where it's at and also the communities that those museums serve. And the conversation has brought together colleagues at different places, specifically the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco, the Broad Museum in Los Angeles, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas, the Addison Gallery of American Art in Andover, Massachusetts, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. Just as important as the question has been the process of reflection and conversation that has ensued, a process that is continuing this week here at Colby, where all of our six partners and us at the Colby Museum have began a conversation yesterday, continue today, and then tomorrow, students who are part of Professor Tanya Sheehan's class in the art department will join our museum partners to share their own insights. To talk about American art is to acknowledge the lands that we are on and the people who have inhabited these lands for millennia, as well as at times violent histories that have ensued. We are in the unceded homelands of the Wabanaki, the traditional homelands of the Abenaki, the Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot peoples. And the rich histories and living cultures of these tribes have been foundational to our region and to today. So supporting Wabanaki artists, continually showcasing their work on their own terms and enabling an indigenous learning and telling of art history remains a commitment that we have as we make our museum part of a process of building a more just future together. A few words about the Lunder Institute for American Art. It was founded as part of the Colby College Museum of Art in 2017, thanks to a generous gift of Peter and Paul Lunder and the Lunder Foundation. It is informed by place, it takes place in collaboration, we talk in community and we work in community, and the Lunder Institute seeks to expand who shapes, in fact, American art and alters its contours. It continually enacts the Colby Museum's mission of access and our commitment to create a forum for research, for dialogue, for joyful connection, for experimentation. From the start, the Lunder Institute has been unique in the field, a museum-based research institute at a liberal arts college, and one working at the intersection of research, scholarship, and art making. The Lunder Institute Art series provides a space for safe and rich conversation across the field with our audiences about larger questions related to American art and therefore the American experience. The series was conceived by our Lunder Institute Director, Erica Wall. And as we close this first season, I have my sincere thanks to Erica and also to Karen Platt. Where's Karen? Somewhere. Who is our manager of administration and strategic initiatives, and also to two people who have been working behind the scenes to create an audio archive, Robbie McVeigh and Teal Baskerville, who have been assisting with the production of this archive. Many others have contributed to its success, including our advancement colleagues, our communications colleagues, colleagues at the Colby Museum across many areas as well. And I thank our ITS team and the Arts Office for helping us realize today's event. Finally, my gratitude to our partners who made it here to Waterville, Maine to be part of this event and these conversations, and my very sincere gratitude to Peter and Paul Lunder and the Lunder Foundation for believing in the Lunder Institute and the mission of Colby College and its museum, and for their profound contribution to the advancement of American art. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. We really appreciate that. And I appreciate your support and that of my colleagues at the Colby College Museum of Art. And this is a really exciting time for the Lunder Institute in having launched this program. I was saying to my colleagues today that I don't think folks quite understand how excited and impactful this particular program is to us, because it culminates what we are most interested in, which is practice, process, how people actually go about what they do to define what American art is within museums and institutions, and that we can gather that information and share that with the public, but we also can archive that through an audio archive that can be shared with those beyond our borders and the work that we do. So I want to thank everyone for being here and sharing in this conversation, but specifically to our colleagues here who are part of this project and the launch of the Lunder Institute at series. So just so that I can kind of put in context a little bit further what we did, basically the Lunder Institute approached several museums asking them if they would be willing to participate in answering the question, what is the state of American art, through a public program. The reason we asked them to engage with the public was because it was a desire to create some transparency around what museums and the practitioners within them do, but also to create a dialogue with those that they serve, their patrons and their audience. And so these lucky 6 participants accepted our invitation and went through the process of having internal conversations with their colleagues about what that would look like and what that means in the context of where they are physically, but what their collection is about and what it is they're trying to communicate. And so this is our opportunity to hear from them how that experience was, what went into the development, and then ultimately the implementation of their public programs, which spanned from February through actually September of 2024, starting with the DeYoung, the Broad, going to Crystal Bridges, then the Addison, the MFA Boston, and then finally going to the Whitney. So we are super excited and really happy to have all of our colleagues here today to talk to us about this. So as I had said, we extended the invitation to engage in this. And so I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, but then to say just a couple of words about what their public program was. And then we'll go into some questions to kind of delve a little bit deeper. So I'm going to start to my immediate left right here with Sheila Presley.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So I work for the DeYoung Museum. We have a sister museum, the Legion of Honor, and we're an encyclopedic museum, but we don't have Asian art. We have a fantastic Asian art museum in San Francisco. So we have several different departments within the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco that deal with American art. We have Art of the Americas, we have contemporary art, modern art, and then we have American art curators. So it becomes sort of a contested issue. And so when Erica first came to us and said, what is American art? We were, really on board. Also, for us in particular, we wanted to look at this question through the lens of interpretation, because we had, post-2020, we had implemented a formal division of interpretation, which we hadn't previously had before. So we wanted to talk about how is the story we tell about American art changing, and who do we need to bring in to the conversation to make it a more truthful conversation. We also were really interested. So our public program, I'll back up, we brought a couple of interpretation specialists from the Bay Area and talked about that work. And then we also were interested in ways that American freedoms were really being infringed upon with, a lot of anti-trans, anti-queer rights, the book bans and not teaching critical race theory. And so we brought in a panel of some artists who were looking at these spaces and had this conversation. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Erica. Hi, everyone. I'm Ed Patuto. I'm Director of Audience Engagement at the Broad Museum in Los Angeles. Unlike the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, we are not an encyclopedic museum. We are a private collection that became a public museum less than 10 years ago, so we're a relatively new institution. And we decided to place our program that was addressing this issue of the state of American art within an exhibition that we curated out of our collection of Los Angeles artists. And we decided to do that for a few different reasons. One is that Los Angeles is a city that has a thriving art scene right now. Actually, one of the only things that is expanding in the city of Los Angeles is the arts institutions, which is really remarkable. But LA as a city is terrible at historicizing itself and really looking across generations in terms of how it is that issues and topics that artists are dealing with are dealt with and how it evolves. So with this exhibition, we were able to look at some of artists who were of our particular generation who taught much younger artists in LA. LA is also known for its art schools. We have really great art schools in Los Angeles. So we had people like Barbara Kruger or Ed Ruscha or John Baldessari, two of which who very much deal with the visual language of Los Angeles as inspiration. And I don't know if any of you spent much time in Los Angeles, but traversing the city in your day-to-day just routine gives you a lot of fodder and just visually is both incredibly disconnected, but also makes you really think a lot about where you are and the kind of cultural influences in the various parts of the city, even architecturally and whatnot. So we chose two artists who are of a younger generation, who were taught by some of those other artists in the show, to speak about how LA is an inspiration for them, and in particular the visual language of Los Angeles. Some of the more less desirable aspects of the city and how they turn it into content and make artwork about it and kind of really slow you down to look at the city in different ways. And so we had Patrick Martinez, who is a native Angelino and makes, he calls them weavings, actually, of pieces of art that sometimes are just neon signs with sayings from various revolutionary leaders. So he takes some of the most kind of overtly and crass forms of advertising neon But we'll have Malcolm X or Che Guevara or other revolutionary leaders, quotes from them, kind of reduced down to these sound bites that you would get on a neon sign. And then also, like, we'll take walls, faded out murals, neon, different things you see, fake flowers, traversing the city, and make incredible wall sculptures out of them. And then the other is Sarah Gomez, who oftentimes paints a more dystopic picture of the city and the scenes of burned out buildings, but is able to find the beauty and capture kind of the light and whatnot of these things. So we had this discussion about LA as inspiration and about really how their lives and this place of LA is influencing their work and shaping their work.
Hi, my name is Kim Conity. I'm the chief curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And I think that a little different from the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, for example, an encyclopedic museum, we are always a museum of American art, and we were founded in 1930, and our collection is roughly really 20th century through today, so through the early 21st century. In that sense, this question of like what is the state of American art is part of our every move, of every work we decide to bring into the collection, of how we show our collections, but we don't always foreground that question. And so I think that was something that was really interesting in this prompt from the Lunder Institute, was an opportunity for us to think a little bit more deeply about that. We had just, when the prompt came in, or the invitation to take part in this program came to us, we had just completed a 4-year-long collection strategic plan. And one of the big parts of that strategic plan was, and a whole chapter was called like the American question, that was the way we titled it, because we think of it as a question that is going to be, that should always be something that we're kind of pushing against and thinking about. There's not an answer. We used that, I would say, as that idea of kind of questioning and kind of continual thinking around America and American art as a way of organizing the program for the Lunder Institute, which was a 2-panel public program, the first of which brought together three of our curators who have, over the last few years, organized or co-organized thematic collection displays around broad themes that, in those themes, whether that was craft or the idea of inheritance, kind of like that meaning not money, but thinking about like how we inherit traditions, ideas, kind of passing along from generation to generation. And then an upcoming exhibition around kind of troubling the idea of landscape. So having those 3 curators really talk about how they thought through those presentations for the Whitney, which allowed them to do much more than what we do when we just like write an introductory text or write wall labels, but really talk through the challenges, how when you put out a theme that is, that could in one way be a way into thinking about some of these kind of questions of American art, how it necessarily challenges what you actually have in your collection. So whether that meant, trying to acquire more work for the show to fill in gaps. And so they spoke together about those 3 presentations. And then the second panel was a moment where we brought in artists, and that's something that also felt very true to the ethos of the Whitney, which was not only founded in 1930 as an American art institution, but also one that would really center artists. And in this case, we brought 2 artists, Every Ocean Hughes and Alan Michelson, both of whom had recently been invited to do presentations at the Whitney, and had, with that invitation, thought very directly about place. So thought not just, thought about what it means to be presenting work at the Whitney and at our downtown site. What are the histories of that site? Alan Michelson really thought about the kind of the history of the Lenape people in New York, and specifically where we were alongside the Hudson. And Every Ocean Hughes was really thinking in their work around the kind of the queer histories of the peers. So it was kind of a beautiful way of bringing together their voices as we think about America, about place, sort of in that way, similar to your kind of LA conversation.
Hello, everyone. I am Mindy Bisa. I'm the Director of Research, Fellowships, and University Partnerships and Curator of American Art at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. What we decided to do for our program, we are soon embarking upon an expansion of our museum, which is also quite young. We were formed 13 years ago, and in the expansion and with some additional expertise and staff members on our team, we decided to really facilitate a conversation we called bite-sized conversations. We actually had 3 small conversations within one event. And it was our curator of contemporary art, Alejo Benedetti, who chose for his conversant Daniel Hatch, a local artist. Our curator of craft, Jen Paget, who chose a ceramicist, Linda Lopez, for her conversation. And Jordan Porman-Cocker, our curator of indigenous art, who brought in Kaylin Faye Barnosky for her conversation. Each conversation was paired with a bite to eat, a cocktail or mocktail, and also a craft. We set the table up, unlike a kind of panel discussion or stadium seating like we are here, in round tables to encourage community connection. So you made a craft, a sleep mask. It was a lot of fun, and you turned to the participant next to you and said, "Hi, I'm Mindy. Oh gosh, what are you doing to your sleep mask?" So the audience was part of the dialogue in that there was some participation, but also in that light of transparency, if we are thinking about how do we define American art for the next generation of Crystal Bridges, and let indigenous art and craft and artists guide us in that conversation, what might we get out of it? And so that was part of the reason that we selected that particular way of doing. And I would say it's also very Crystal Bridges of us. We talk about like how to flip a format of a panel discussion a little bit sideways to see what else we can shake out of it. So that was our program.
Hi, I'm Rachel Vogel, Assistant Curator at the Addison Gallery of American Art in Andover, Massachusetts, which is, on the campus of Phillips Academy. And for the past several years, we have kind of conceptualized our programming and our exhibitions through this driving question of what is America? So when the invitation came in, it seemed perfect. These were questions that we were already really thinking about and driven by. But there was a temporality to the question, what is the state of American art implies, what are we looking at today? Which inspired us to think back at the Addison's founding, which like the Whitney was founded in 1930. And our founding terms of trust include a very specific definition of American art that restricts it to native-born or naturalized citizens. So we wanted to kind of self-reflexively examine this definition of American art and think about the context of this definition at the time of the museum's founding, as well as think about how that definition has shifted and expanded in the intervening nearly 100 years. So prior to the program, I was very interested in how other museums of American art or American art departments within larger encyclopedic museums defined American art for their own purposes of acquisition and exhibition. So I sent out a survey to a few dozen institutions, and many of my colleagues on stage responded to help contextualize how we have this very specific definition. How are other museums defining it? And then we had, for the actual program, 2 panels, the first of which was thinking about American art at this moment of the museum's founding, which we contextualized by having a scholar of citizenship and immigration and history department at UPenn think about what citizenship meant in the 1930s, who that included, who that excluded, and in the decades before and after, how those definitions were evolving and constituted by different groups and continued exclusions, as well as thinking about what the state of American art was in terms of museums like MFA Boston and the Met, and the development of their American wings, which are happening about the same time as the Addison's founding, as well as Gordon, our curator, gave a presentation specifically about the context of the Addison's founding. And then the second panel was thinking about what has changed? And so I presented the results of the survey, which were illuminating in a lot of ways. I think one of the key conclusions was that despite institutions having American art often in their name, the definitions of that were still murky. Often institutions didn't, in their founding documents or mission statement, explicitly describe what they meant, much like I'm sure in your conversations at the beginning of this program, found that it's kind of tricky to concisely put it into words. We also heard from curators who are embarking on reinstallation projects that are really reimagining what American art means, as well as a presentation by the Puerto Rican American artist Miguel Luciano, who helped us think about citizenship from the perspective of American territories and what that means when thinking about national identity, citizenship, nationalism. We are a teaching museum on the campus of a high school, so in between these panels, we also invited students to respond to this prompt with their own art making, and so there was a program where they had a sort of poster session presenting their work, which included everything from a reinterpreting of Robert Frank's American series through the perspective of queer and trans masculine experience, to a audio composition that was thinking about Asian American and Black American solidarity during the civil rights movement. So we tried to approach this question from a bunch of angles. Of course, the conclusions are ones that are not going to be, this isn't a question that can be answered. So it was more of an invitation for future conversations rather than ever answering the question of what is America or American art.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Leila Bermeo, and I am curator of paintings in the Art of the Americas department at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. This was a department that I had long wanted to work in, because when we say American art at the MFA Boston, we are not just referring to art of the United States, but we are responsible for collecting and interpreting and displaying art from all across Latin America, Canada, including indigenous and island nations as well. If you've been to the MFA, you might know that much of that is still an ambition, and most of our galleries are firmly still dedicated to fancy things made by white artists for fancy white people. But I think you really have to have the vision and the space in order to make the kinds of changes that you want to see and in order to create the kind of museum that you want to visit. So kind of to build on what Rachel was saying, a lot of these conversations had already been happening within the MFA and especially within the Art of the Americas department. I'm here today in place of a former colleague, Michael Bramwell, who was our inaugural curator of folk and self-taught art. And Michael, as part of thinking more broadly about these questions about the Americas and who is an American artist, was really interested in kind of blowing up definitions of folk and self-taught art. And this was, interestingly, I mean, a conversation that I think had started long before either I or he were part of the team at the MFA. If you walk into the folk art gallery, we have a dedicated folk art gallery in the wing, and the text panel starts off with the phrase, folk art is hard to define. Like it had always been sort of built in, even as we were displaying it, right? This kind of tension was sort of built into it. What was so interesting about Michael was that he didn't kind of want to just stop there or be like, you know, this is a category that needs to be challenged, but he was really interested in how we could think about folk artists not only as someone like Ammi Phillips or William Edmondson, but also about how maybe like a blue chip artist like David Hammonds was maybe drawing from a certain kind of aesthetic that self-taught artists had developed, so that like academically trained artists could also sort of be engaged with definitions of folk. And I think sort of starting with that question, when the invitation from the Lunder came, he was really excited to develop a program around those questions that would include artists such as Lonnie Hawley, but also scholars of folklore, a writer for the New York Times, various museum professionals that could really look at this question from different angles. And it very much confirmed, what we sort of already thought, which is that audiences especially do not care about any kind of definition of folk or self-taught. And I would say we are still yet left with this question of kind of where to go next.
Thanks to all of you. I really appreciate that. So that is just a very, just skimming the surface of what transpired at each of these sites. And they are all recorded and available for you on online. So hopefully take advantage when you have free time to actually enjoy all of these 6 programs. My first question was going to be, why did you accept? But I think it's quite clear why everyone accepted. As I said, we are most interested in the process. We understand that the product is still in process. So I'm wondering if anyone would want to share with us what exactly, what did the process look like for you at your institution? And I think we've talked at length today as a group, but maybe share, when you thought about who your thought partners were within your institution internally, were they those that you usually go to? Was this an opportunity to think about, let's talk to, did you go outside of the institution at all to think about who might be partners in starting to develop what a public program could be?
I'll jump in. At Crystal Bridges, we do, as I had said, the 3 curators that participated in the panel or in the bite-sized conversations were, at the time, charged with really a small group of working through what does a fully reinstalled museum look like. In perhaps these months of hindsight, that seems a little unfair to put it in just 3 curators bucket, but to be able to come together and figure this out, and really it was about how do you invite community and audience into the conversation. So right away, we knew it needed to be outwardly looking, and so we partnered with the learning and engagement team, specifically with public programs, to just talk through what has been successful in the past and what might work in the future, and what was something we've never tried before. And it grew out of organically thinking, how do you look to other models of building community in a program? Instead of just sitting and listening, that was such an important thing, to build community within the audience and actually embrace pauses and transitions and those moments. We couldn't have done that just curatorially. That's part of the specialness, I think, of Crystal Bridges, is to think across departments and strategies, and then to try new things we hadn't ever tried. I think making something at the more than 100 people in a room together. We've done it with small groups, but that was also something. So that was part of it, and then involving the artists. But it took a while to land on this. And I think maybe once we talk about it as it already happened, we're like, oh yeah, of course we just did it this way because that's what we do. But Erica, you're not kind of being fair in that you didn't tell us how to do it. You just said you should have a conversation with the public. And I think all of us, I know, asked Erica, well, what's the Broad doing? What's the DeYoung doing? How's the Whitney going to do this? And of course, none of us actually reached out to each other to ask about that, because it's like you have this, what can we do that's unique, but yet talk together, but be specific to place. It's kind of hard, it doesn't come so quickly, but which is why it's So nice to have so many thought partners on a team.
I also want to say that we did it kind of differently, and I should also mention that the Lunder Institute was also incredibly generous. Not only did they invite us to be part of this compelling conversation, but they also said, we will fund this panel or this public program. So in my institution, we're like, ha ha, we have this money, we can do what we want. So we like kind of hoarded it in a weird sort of way, because I feel like at a lot of museums, this might be surprising, but the curatorial voice is very privileged. And we thought let's bring in more the interpretation voice and the artist voice. And we were kind of oddly sort of secretive about what we did. We wanted to put together this panel without kind of collaborating with a lot of internal stakeholders, which was, I don't know, different from how we normally do things. And it was it was really freeing for us to be able to put together a panel that wasn't based on, you know, an exhibition or our permanent collection. So yeah, that was a real treat.
The Addison has a pretty small staff, so I think probably every single person in the museum ended up touching this project in one way or another. But I think what is interesting in retrospect about the way that we approached this project is, even though it was very inward looking, we're thinking about our own history and our own future, it was important to have this sort of kaleidoscopic view, which involved, you know, the presentations of historians who, you know, she was kind of skeptical, this is Hardeep Dillon, of the invitation, because, you know, what do I have to contribute to a conversation about American art? I'm not an Americanist. And the perspective of artists, the perspective of other curators. And so I think it was, you know, bringing together this sort of interdisciplinary, the perspective of students as well, that sort of reaffirmed this idea that we've all been talking about, that, you know, there are a million ways in which we can approach this question, and yet it will never be exhausted. And so I think it was that multiplicity of perspectives. We really did treat it as an invitation to look out beyond who we would perhaps typically collaborate with in order to tell a richer story and convey more perspectives on this question.
I was thinking about something that you sort of opened with, Sheila, which was that the Lunder Institute not only offered this invitation, but also offered funding to make it happen. And just want to underscore that was really meaningful at the Whitney as well, in the sense that, my colleague Megan Hoyer, who's here, who's the Director of Public Programs and Academic Engagement, with whom we work very often curatorially on all of our programs, but we've often talked about the fact that at the Whitney, too, it's really the special exhibition program that generally has within its budgets, possibilities for programming. And we often want to do, what about those more, what are the conversations we can have around our collection or around the work we're doing internally? So this was a really exciting opportunity for us. And I think the way that we came to the idea for the program was definitely not immediate. It was many, many conversations, many different permutations. I think because we don't often have this opportunity to really dig into a question like this and think about our collection. And at the end of the day, where we landed was very much thinking about what are those conversations that we're having internally all the time, and the kind of conversations that we have with artists all the time in preparation for their shows that we don't always talk about externally and with a public. And so we really leaned into that. And it was interesting how it was almost like one of those situations where maybe the best thing for us to have done with this was something that was right in front of us the whole time. And it took us a little bit to get there. And at the end of the day, I think that was, we recognize the value in opportunities for sharing out our own questioning, our own thinking, how we get to what you see when you come to the museum and things are on the walls.
I I really appreciate everyone saying that. And I will say that there is a significance to the Lunder Institute being a part of Colby College and the Colby College Museum of Art, because what everyone is talking about here is about the experience of working in the arts and within institutions, and the young people that attend this institution, some of whom I've talked with, there is really an opacity to that. It is not transparent, and you may not understand what actually is involved in this, but there are these moments that everyone, and we talked about this at, I'm not sure what convening, but there is a great amount of passion in the work that curators, educators, registrars do that isn't easily translated in what you see when you come into museum space. And we very rarely get an opportunity to talk about it because we're doing it, but there is so much to do, and there's so much to share about that experience, and it's very generative, and it's important that there is a transparency around it, and that the work that people who come into these spaces do adds to all of this. But I think that there is a reality around, again, I guess the scale or the magnitude of what goes on within institutions to get all of that work up on a beautifully manicured gallery wall or what. It's very important, it's very involved, and it's very complex, and we've had numerous conversations about how we communicate that work and how we interact and serve those that come in to really appreciate, understand, and understand what we do, with a bit of trepidation around not wanting to offend anyone while we do this. And I think that that's very important. I don't know if everyone quite grasps that, because I think in the conversations that we had, and I appreciate that, I feel like there is a certain amount of, of liberty that came with this experience, and I just wondered how that was translated into the interactions that you had. So I think, what we're probably all very interested in is, what did you find out of this for either yourself or those who were part of this project to be most exciting, not as exciting? What are the takeaways? And is there anything that is sustainable for you that will help you and inform what you do moving forward?
For our program, I know one of the things that was most exciting was that when we first started advertising the event, that we were going to have this this public program dedicated to kind of challenging definitions of folk and self-taught art, we actually had to change the room to a bigger room because so many people registered. So, I don't say that just to pat ourselves on the back, but because I'm trying to make a point about how it's we hadn't done that before, right? So we didn't know that people, if you don't offer it to people, you have no way of knowing that this is something that they're interested in, right? And so that was incredibly powerful, and that was an opportunity that the Lunder gave us. Within the conversation itself, again, I think a lot of the speakers, in very different ways, reaffirmed a word that Rachel used earlier, something that we had sort of already been thinking of, but I think for me also it raised other kinds of questions. We don't like the category of folk art because it is largely classist. It has to do completely with something that art collectors rather than artists came up with, right? But I think to do away with it completely, now where I'm sort of after the conversation, what I'm thinking of is that doing away with it completely also erases part of the economic history of why certain things are in museums and other things are not. And so it actually raises a completely different set of questions that I don't think we would have arrived at had we not had this conversation.
One of the interesting things that came out of the conversation that we had, so both Patrick Martinez and Sarah Gomez went to art school in LA, then became artists, established themselves, then got married and began having children. And it was really interesting because they talked quite openly about how their relationship to art making changed once they had children, and also how the relationship to the city of LA changed and changed their artwork because of raising a family. And it made us think about that, you know, we don't always see artists in their totality of their lives and how the totality of their lives affects what they do in the studio. And so that is something that we intend to bring more of into our programming. You know, and it kind of really, I think it gives people a different path into their work. And, you know, something that we like to do is to really have a visitor-centric perspective as much as possible in the programming we do, and I think it really does help people connect more, you know, with the artists and with what they're doing, and understanding it from a perspective that's very relatable to them, which is one of the goals of the institution. So it was one of those moments where, like, oh wow, we should do more with this. You know, we should maybe not try to have such art-specific conversations, but also just conversations about people's lives and what impact that has on what they're doing in their studio and what they want to say.
We've talked a lot in our conversations about audience, and I think, you know, when we were thinking about our program, we thought that perhaps this would most appeal to people who were museum professionals, who were academics. I mean, this is a symposium on a Sunday about the state of American art. Like, this seemed kind of inside baseball. But what was surprising is that the majority of our audience was community members. And I think that a takeaway is that all visitors, our community, not just specialists in American art or in museums, were interested in the kinds of questions that we were asking internally, the kinds of conversations that were driving the work that we do. And it was a helpful reminder to, I think, like Kim was speaking about, to let the public into these conversations perhaps more frequently, or in ways that, you know, are not so protective of the work that we do behind the scenes, that is of interest and of value for our audiences to hear more about.
We talked this morning about this need that museums feel to present this polished surface and to never invite the audience into these difficult conversations. But I think we did learn that the audience is interested in those. And I'm cognizant of the fact that we're at, the college campus right now, and there's a lot of students in the audience. And what Erica was saying earlier about there's so many different careers in museums, and we really do a disservice to our visitors by not making it clear the many different forms of labor that go into presenting works of art in a museum setting, because there's so many different ways that people with different backgrounds and different voices and different educations can really contribute to this work that I think we all would agree is, we're pretty passionate about. So I guess I just want to put that pitch out there for the students, like, go to these conversations at museums and really, really question how things are when you go to museums. How do things end up on the wall, and who wrote that text?
I would definitely echo that. That is why it was so important that we have Lunder Institute at Colby, because this is the sort of these are the sort of conversations that I think need to be had when you start to explore what it is you're interested, or whether or not you go into the arts. But I will ask our panel here. I mean, we're happy we took jobs in the arts, right? Okay, see, it's okay. I often talk to students that are very afraid. Don't be afraid. There's a lot to do. There's a lot of work to do. So, and I think that this is, again, just a reflection of the opportunities that there are to explore and expand on the work that we do. Before we open it up to questions, I also wanted to ask the group, if in fact, the goal of this project was to be able to create a space where, or a vehicle for institutions to be in conversation with one another. And I'm curious, do you feel that there's been a benefit to bring all of you together to talk? And what might be the best benefit of that, or what you would take away from it?
I want to say, hell yeah. No, absolutely. There's a phenomenal value to bringing us together to do this. I feel like we learn more about our own institutions by talking to each other than being in our own institutions, because it gives you a different context to reflect upon how you do things. And so often than not, and we did speak about this today some too, we're so focused on getting everything done that we don't really think about how are we doing things and what does it mean for the field, and culture, I think, plays an extraordinary role in shaping how we see ourselves as Americans, how we see the rest of the world. And we're in a time when that's really up for grabs right now. And so being able to sit down with colleagues and reflect about what are we doing here in our institutions is, to me, it's invaluable, and it's absolutely vital to the success of culture continuing to have a relevance to people.
I think there's also some vulnerability in this, in that not only do we really have the privilege of learning how each of us kind of exists in this messy state, and despite the fact that I also work in a museum where we worry about putting something out there that's not super polished, but yet somehow in my mind, the Whitney knows what they're doing, and they always have everything in complete, perfect order. And, but that kind of vulnerability to even share with each other in a closed room, let alone in front of an audience, that we really have much more in common than we even let each other sometimes think. And there's also, it was almost like a group therapy. So, there's that benefit as well with coming together with colleagues, and then just connecting with people. I've seen names, written down, but then to actually meet people in person. There's nothing like an in-person engagement.
It reminds me a little bit of what you said, Ed, before about your program and having artists, like also having a way of like having artists bring their kind of whole selves, and how that, like, that's the other aspect, I think, of the in-person gatherings that you get that we don't otherwise have that opportunity for. So it's not just the sharing of what our institutions are doing and those big meta questions and the very tactical ones that we share, but also of getting to know our colleagues in other institutions as whole people. And you never know what, conversations or what things you might be thinking about years down the line that you may think, oh, that reminds me of something. And those connections that one makes in these kind of gatherings, I think, are, to your point, like, are indispensable.
So with that, I am going to open up questions from our audience for any of our panelists. The lovely Teal will come to you with the microphone.
Hi, this is for anyone who wants to answer, or all of you, if you guys want to as well. The United States has a long history of colonialism, either through westward expansion, native erasure, etc. How are you and your individual institutions dealing with this issue, as well as the issue of repatriation, when answering the question, what is American art?
I'll let you guys take that.
I'm going to pull on just one of the questions you asked about repatriation, because even in an early conversation with the curators that were leading the dialogue at Crystal Bridges, Jordan, the curator of Indigenous art, specifically pointed to the revisions in the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, as it's often called, that happened in January of this year. So this is like live updates, and called it an invitation to conversation, an invitation to reassessing what we have, what we don't have, who is represented, who's not represented, and how can actually issues that can sometimes feel a little constraint and stress, like something like NAGPRA, holding institutions accountable from a legal side, actually be an invitation to different kinds of dialogue. And so that's a little bit how it's happening at Crystal Bridges, and actually she even had a revision to her title to be a NAGPRA officer after she had been hired. So sometimes it's also about taking the things that are stressful about a colonial history that is, even if you're a brand new museum, we are part of a system built on empire building and collecting and genocide and all of those. You still inherit all of that, and it can't be denied. It's just when you can turn this into a moment of generosity and invitation instead of closing down and protecting your stuff. So I don't know, someone else probably has a different answer.
Yeah, we also, no, not a different answer. I think building on that, because we also, are in a kind of fortunate space of having a curator who is fully dedicated to Native American art, my colleague Marina Tykenko, and until recently we also had a dedicated NAGPRA collections fellow who recently ended their fellowship, but also had to kind of wrangle with these new legal issues, and they sort of they become visible in ways that are really interesting. So like the first thing we did was we had taken objects off view that could be sensitive, and under the new laws, just out of a kind of abundance of caution, had taken off even more objects that actually wound up going back on view because we consulted with, in this case, it was the Haida and Tlingit people who told us, nope, these objects are not sensitive, they can go back on view. And so they went back on view with a new label that included language and credited them for their consultation on the objects. And so what a better way to display these objects anyway, right? And that came out of this new law. So that is one way. I think what's interesting is that the United States has NAGPRA. Other parts of the Americas do not. And so we have to sort of think about the sort of strangeness of having objects from, say, like Maya communities that are right next to objects that are protected by NAGPRA, but there isn't a version of that in Latin America. And so what's helpful still is that these questions get raised, and we have to think about how, like, the answer is never to just do nothing, right? Like, we can still reach out to people of Maya descent. We can decide whether or not these objects should be private instead of on public view. We can use language. We can think of new ways to do things, which I think we would not be thinking as actively or taking as many steps if these weren't coming down from some kind of like larger government regulation.
I think we are a contemporary art museum. Our collection, the earliest really starts in the 60s. So we don't have the same issue of collecting, art from, indigenous cultures. However, we are doing a project currently that where we've centered, we take indigenous knowledge relationship to the planet and the earth. It's Joseph Beuys, an important, influential German artist who was a member of the Hitler Youth in the Luftwaffe, was shot down, and then had a complete turnaround in terms of his politics and worldview, and committed himself. He was a founding member of the Green Party in Germany, started the Office of Direct Democracy, thinking that people should directly decide what policies are. And so he did a project to help Kassel, Germany, heal after World War II, where they planted 7,000 oaks with big boulders next to them, basalt stones. And he did that as an act of reconciliation and healing. So we decided, okay, we're right now in Los Angeles, the Getty Foundation, every 5 years, does something called Pacific Standard Time, where they choose a theme. This year it's Art and Science Collide. And all the arts institutions in Southern California focus on that in different ways. And you make proposals, they approve them. They said, we really want to do stuff with indigenous knowledge. So we decided that we would do a forestation project inspired by boys, but using native plants, and use it as an opportunity to teach people about how the indigenous people, the Tongva people, took care of the land, how they related to it, their knowledge, their philosophies. And we invited them in and literally have developed a whole curriculum around this for students. And, we didn't have anyone, it's an online curriculum, we didn't have anyone who really knew how to design curriculum in that way for students. And so we had to hire out consultants, but then we gave it all to these indigenous leaders we were working with and said, have your way with it. And they radically rewrote the thing and redesigned the thing. And there was a little pushback with some of the language, which was extremely strong. But we decided to keep that in, that we could not invite people into our institution and ask them then to, and then say, oh, but, not there. And we are also having them, these two indigenous leaders, train our staff. And we're thinking about different ways, of engaging in the galleries, maybe using some of the perspectives that they have. There are these concepts that they're teaching us about how they, actually it's interesting because one of them, who is an artist, Lazaro Arvizu Jr., is now starting to talk about some of the indigenous practices, the ways that they did things. Like he'll talk about the fact that, there was no such thing as an artist in indigenous culture because everybody participated in making objects, in creating music, in creating dance. And, boys said that everyone is an artist. So it's interesting to see how, to give these indigenous cultural leaders, a blue chip artist, from Germany, and to see them kind of take it and, relate to it and make it their own, has really been a very gratifying process. But, I think if it weren't for, the Getty giving us this opportunity to do it, those moments I think are rare, but we're realizing that there should be a lot more of these in what we do. And we're now training, we're doing projects with like tree people that plants trees all over the city, and they're asking for the training from these folks too. It's kind of exciting to see organizations and institutions open up to this, to completely different ways of thinking and looking at things.
There's one more question.
Although it sounds like the conclusion is that there's no specific answer for what is the state of American art. Were there any consistent ideas or themes or concepts that came out to address that question?
Yeah, so the survey showed what I think we all have experienced, which is that these distinctions are very much in flux at the moment, and also that a lot of the ways that museums do things, divisions, categories, is sort of idiosyncratic and based on just how things had been done. And so I think in our conversations as well, it seems like one kind of conclusion is that we are at this moment of reassessment of what the field could look like in ways that radically depart from the way American art has been historicized in textbooks and American art surveys. And I think something else that we talked about was the sort of rapid response of museums, that while it might take, a decade to produce a new curriculum and a new textbook, that we can answer these questions provisionally in real time, so that we get to experiment, and this is something that we do very explicitly at the Addison, because we reinstall our entire museum twice a year. We don't have any permanently installed galleries. So we are always offering a sort of provisional answer to this question that will then change 6 months later. And I think that is an important role of museums in establishing, as well as constantly revising our understanding of American art, is that acknowledging that constant change and that constant need for reassessment and also self-reflection.
I think that's, I would sort of second everything you're saying. I think that for the Whitney in particular, and this is a little dissimilar to the sort of America's department at the MFA, we are really a museum of art of the United States. So we often, even in our mission statement for the Whitney Museum of American Art, we quickly pivot to say, not pivot, we quickly focus to say, art of the United States, to add that kind of clarity. And I would say that because we are pretty clear about being about art of the United States, there has often been a question about, so America is a pretty big term to be throwing around, and is that actually what you are? And what, it also causes a lot of questions. And I think this is something that we've talked about a lot internally. I mentioned in the strategic plan that it's really the American question. We talked a lot about what it means, like what it would mean to take that word away entirely, and to, what it would mean to rename our institution, or to just strip that away. But interestingly, we sort of came back in a sense to the power of the word America, American, as something that, as long as we continue to really probe it, to question it, to recognize that it will shift, that the perceptions of that will change over time, if we keep that central to everything we're doing, then that is the impact that we want to make as an institution. And in time, I think right now we have on view our Glenn Ligon sculpture, kind of light sculpture, Rooken figure, which has the word America right side up. And in the 2016 election following that, the artist asked us to reinstall it upside down. So there are ways where literally that very word we have seen just how powerful that can be as something to question and to hold on to.
Ed and I were talking before this panel just a little while ago about a performance art piece where we put the labels on the walls in pencil, and then we crossed out the terms as quickly as all the terms and the interpretation changed, because we may move more quickly than some institutions, but compared to social media, we're glacial. But it's constantly in the changing and the redefining and asking ourselves these questions that I think we hopefully find the meaning.
So I think from this we'll come away with it's in process. It's always in process. And I want to thank each of our panelists and all of our partners for the Lunder Institute AT program in 2024 for accepting our invitation and for being in conversation with us, because that is what we are about. And the conversation will continue, and we will include all of you as that continues as well. And we appreciate all of you for spending the evening with us and being a part of this. And so I hope that you will join us for a reception afterward. But thanks to all of you, and thanks to all of you.